In August of 2019, Dale Poston stood in the middle of a Cass County, Missouri soil health meeting and told the room politely and with the confidence of a man who had a master's degree from the University of Missouri and 20 years of extension service behind him that Dorothea Krause's operation was at best a hobby farm. He said it without cruelty. He meant it as a practical assessment. He had looked at the acreage, looked at the flock count, and looked at the yields she had been posting. And, to a man trained to read farms as input-output spreadsheets, the arithmetic did not favor her. 60 turkeys in a 3-ring binder full of her late husband's handwriting were not an agronomic strategy. They were sentiment, he said gently. They were sentiment dressed in overalls. 4 years later, on the 12th of September, 2023, a buyer from the Heartland Organic Cooperative named Renata Voss stood at the edge of a 38-acre cornfield outside of Harrisonville and read a yield ticket aloud. The field had been grazed by turkeys. It had never seen a synthetic nitrogen application since 2017. It had come through the worst drought Cass County had recorded in 40 years, on nothing but what the ground held and what 60 heritage breed birds had put into it across 9 seasons. The number on that ticket was 218 bushels per acre. The county average that year, across 14 counties under agricultural emergency, was 89 bushels per acre. Merrill Tappan's 480 irrigated acres to the east, even with his well pump running through August, had yielded 112. Renata did not negotiate the price she offered for Dottie's corn. She said $7.80 a bushel, and she said it once, and then she was quiet for a long time. This is the story of the 35 years between Walt Krause's first notebook entry and that silence. It is the story of what 60 birds can do to a piece of ground that a spreadsheet will never see coming. And if you have ever suspected that the thing a system cannot measure is sometimes the only thing that matters, stay a moment, because the arithmetic on this one is going to be specific. Let me tell you what happened in that field and how it came to grow corn head-high in a drought year, while the county around it cracked and failed. Dorothea Krause had farmed the Krause ground in Cass County for 41 years by the time Dale Poston called it a hobby. She was 67 years old, lean and slightly stooped in the way of women who have spent decades at physical work, with silver-white hair cut short and tucked under a canvas field hat, and pale hazel eyes that had a habit of going very still when she was thinking hard. She had what the neighbors called patience, and what she called not being in a hurry to be wrong. The farm was 240 acres total, 190 of it in cropland, and 50 in woodlot and creek-bottom timber situated on the river-bottom ground west of Harrisonville, where the soil is deep and dark, and where the old tile drainage systems from the 1952nd still run under the fields in clay pipe. The ground was good ground. It was also in the stretches that had been farmed hard for 30 years before Walt bought it. Ground that had developed a problem nobody had thought to look for. Walt Krause had looked for it. That was the thing about Walt. He was not a man with advanced degrees, but he was the kind of man who noticed when something did not add up and then spent years figuring out why. Walt had died in 2014, a stroke, quick, in March, and he had left Dottie the farm, the debt-free deed, a 12-year-old pickup, and a 3-ring binder with blue plastic cover cracked along the spine that contained 36 years of turkey rotation records going back to 1988. He had written in pencil, in a small, neat hand, the dates of every flock passed across every field section, the bird counts, the observed soil conditions before and after the cover crop seed mixes, and in the later years, the yield figures per section. The binder was what the farm ran on. To Dottie, it was as essential as the tile maps. The turkeys were heritage bronze, a strain Walt had sourced from a breeder in Crawford County in 1987 and had been selecting within ever since. 60 birds was the number he had settled on in the early 90s, after trying 80 and trying 40 and finding that 60 gave the right density of scratch and dung across the portable pen sections without overloading any single patch. The alpha tom of the current flock was a bird Dottie called Barley, for no reason she could articulate, except that he was the color of rye at harvest and had a disposition that reminded her of Walt. Unhurried, observant, not interested in being told what to do. Barley was 6 years old in 2019 and weighed 23 pounds and moved through the field with the slow, deliberate authority of an animal that knew its job. Let me tell you about the drained field problem, because it is the reason 60 turkeys could do what a $340,000 self-propelled sprayer could not. River bottom ground in Cass County carries old tile drainage systems, as I said, but it also carries something nobody was mapping anymore by the time the Extension Service stopped recommending soil pits. That something is a compaction layer called a fragipan, which forms naturally in some Missouri clay loam profiles and can be worsened by decades of heavy equipment passes running at the same depth. The fragipan sits at 8 to 12 inches below the surface. It is dense. Corn roots, which need to go to 24 inches or deeper to access subsoil moisture in a dry year, cannot push through it. A fragipan acts like a false floor. In a wet year, it traps water above the layer, drowning root tips. In a dry year, it stops roots from chasing the moisture below it. Either way, the crop suffers. The conventional management answer in Cass County was tile drainage and irrigation. Drain the excess water before it drowns the roots, then pump water back from a well when dry conditions arrived. Merle Tappan's operation was built on exactly this logic, and for most years it worked well enough. Walt Krause had noticed something different in the late 1982. He had noticed that the sections of his fields where his turkeys had been rotated showed different behavior after wet springs. They drained faster, and they also greened up faster in dry stretches. He wrote about it in the binder. Starting in 1991, he took soil samples. By 1998, he had enough data to form a hypothesis. The turkeys were breaking the fragipan. A heritage turkey's legs are not a chicken's legs. They are built for 20-pound birds that spend their lives walking and scratching, and when 60 of them work a section of field over 3 to 4 passes per season, each bird scratching to a depth of 10 to 12 inches across every square foot of the pen area, the cumulative mechanical action on a clay loam fragipan. It does not break the layer in one season. Over 6 or 7 years of consistent rotation, the layer loosens, cracks, and eventually loses its density. Walt had measured this with a penetrometer, which is a soil compaction probe, and he had recorded his readings in the binder. By 2005, the sections he had been rotating the flock across for 15 years showed fragipan resistance readings of 180 to 220 psi at 10 inches. Sections he had not rotated showed readings of 480 to 600 psi. Corn roots can push through about 300 psi. Through 500 they cannot. The dung was the second mechanism. A heritage bronze turkey in active foraging drops roughly 0.8 pounds of actual nitrogen per bird day on pasture-bound inorganic compounds that release slowly across the following season. 60 birds across a 38-acre field section over 4 passes in a season deliver approximately 480 bird days of nitrogen application. Walt had worked this out in his binder in 1996. The math was not exact. By the time Dottie had taken over the operation in 2014, the turkey-grazed fields had not received a synthetic nitrogen application in 7 years. The birds, combined with the cereal rye and tillage radish cover crop mix she seeded each September, were meeting the corn crop's nitrogen demand of approximately 140 pounds per acre per second easen. Dottie knew the radish because Walt had written about it. The tillage radish drove a taproot 8 to 14 inches into the softened fragipan zones, pumping water downward in wet conditions, like a slow drain, and leaving channels that the corn roots could follow in dry ones. She saved her own rye and radish seed each fall. Her cover crop seed cost was $14.4 per acre. Merle Tappan's nitrogen fertilizer alone ran $180 per acre in 2022. This is what the Extension Service spreadsheet could not see. The turkeys were not a hobby. They were a soil-building engine running on 35 years of compounding interest. Caleb Krause arrived in April of 2022 with a degree in agricultural business from Missouri State, a clean, athletic jacket, and a set of opinions he had not yet been embarrassed out of. He was 28, Dottie's grandson, and he had come back to help with the farm the way a person who has studied something formally sometimes comes back, certain he could see the situation more clearly than the person who had been living it. He sat at the kitchen table the first evening with the county's extension newsletter open on his phone and Dottie's ledger open in front of him, and he looked at the yields she had been posting: 148 bushels per acre in 2019, 163 in 2020, 171 in 2021. On ground she was inputting for $110 per acre all in, and he said what Caleb said, which was that the numbers were fine, but the scale was too small. The system was too dependent on the birds, and that if she ever lost the flock to disease, she would have no fallback. He said this with the measured evenness of someone who had spent 2 years being taught to read farm operations as production functions, and who had been graded on his ability to identify inefficiencies. He had been a good student. He had internalized the idea that an operation under 200 acres with 60 birds and no hired labor and a seed-saving program that predated the internet was not a model, it was an artifact. His professors had not taught him to see artifacts as anything other than things waiting to be replaced. Dale Poston says this kind of operation is always going to be a hobby farm, Caleb said. He did not say it cruelly. He said it the way a young man says a thing he has heard from someone credentialed and has not yet had reason to question. Dottie looked at the ledger, then she looked out the kitchen window at the dark where the field was. Then she said, "Get your boots. I'll show you something in the morning." If you have ever come back to a piece of ground and found it different than you expected it to be, you know what Caleb found in that field at 6 in the morning with the April mud still cold. The corn from the previous season had been rolled under. The rye was green and 8 inches tall, and where Dottie moved the portable pen section with barley and the 60 birds ahead of them, the soil came up in the scratch marks, not in clods, but in crumbled dark aggregates, with a smell that Caleb would later describe as alive. He did not say much that morning. He had not been prepared for the smell of the soil. He took his own penetrometer reading that afternoon. The center of the section the birds had been rotating across since 2015. The probe stopped at the 12-inch mark and required nearly all of his weight to push further. He checked the gauge. Then he walked to the fence line and pushed the probe into the section that had not been rotated. a strip of ground that Dottie kept in soybeans and that had seen a planter and a sprayer and nothing else for 15 years. The probe stopped at 7 inches. He came back across the field with the probe in his hand and found Dottie by the pen gate watching him. "You could have just told me," he said. "I could have," she said. "Now you know." He stayed. He helped. He was not yet converted, but he had started asking questions about the binder. He carried it out to the field some evenings and read it in the truck, while Dottie moved the pen, and he started cross-referencing Walt's yield records by section against the penetrometer readings Walt had logged in a table in the back pages. The correlation was not subtle. On the sections where Walt had been rotating the birds since the early 90s, yield had climbed from an average of 102 bushels per acre in 1992 to 164 by 2008, tracking closely with the declining compaction readings. On the untouched sections, yield had plateaued at 118 bushels and stayed there for 12 years. Caleb was a good enough student to understand a regression when he saw one. If you have ever watched someone change their mind, not because of an argument, but because of a measurement, think about what it looks like. It is not dramatic. It is a person who goes quiet and does not immediately say what they were about to say. That was April. By May, Caleb had stopped mentioning Dale Poston. There are probably people watching this who have seen something like this on their own land or in their own work, a place where the conventional model told you one thing and the ground told you something else entirely. If that is you, the comment section is worth something. Leave it there. The rest of the story is going to get to some specific numbers, and I think you will want to stay for them. Meanwhile, east of the fence line, Merle Tappan was in his second full season with the new self-propelled sprayer, and by every visible measure he was doing exactly what a good, careful farmer was supposed to do. Merle was 58 and had 480 irrigated acres in continuous corn. Most of it rented ground he had farmed for other owners going on 20 years, and he was known in the county as a man who kept his equipment clean and his spray records complete and his yield maps current. He had borrowed $280,000 in operating credit against the 2022 season and had purchased the sprayer in late 2021 for $340,000, financed over 7 years. The machine was a thing of genuine capability with a 60-foot boom, GPS auto guidance, and variable rate nozzle technology that could modulate application across different soil zones within a single pass. When it ran across Merle's fields in the early morning light, it was beautiful in the way that a large, precise machine working at its designed function is beautiful, and the County Extension newsletter had run a photograph of it in the March issue with a caption about precision agriculture in Cass County. Dottie watched it from her fence line without criticism. She had liked Merle since they were both young, and she understood what he had done and why he had done it. Merle had followed the advice the Extension Service had given him, the same advice the county agricultural lender had given him, the same advice that 8 of his neighbors had followed, and that the university field day demonstrations had confirmed with trial data going back 15 years. The advice said that the path to profitability in modern corn farming was scale and input precision. Get big enough to spread the equipment costs, get the yields above 200 bushels per acre, with the inputs to prove it was possible, and hold the line on the rental rates that came with each new crop year. Merle's operation was not inefficient. It was exactly what the model prescribed. His risk was the risk built into the model itself, which was a risk the model called manageable and which no one, on either side of the fence line, had yet been shown cause to name anything different. In the spring of 2023, the first signs of what was coming had already been in the weather data for 6 months, But the county had been through dry forecasts before, and the forecasts had moderated, and everyone had gone on planting. May of 2023 was warm and dry. June broke the record for consecutive days above 95 degrees in Cass County, going back to 1934, and the record before that had stood for 54 years. By the 15th of July, the USDA Soil Moisture Monitoring Station, at the Harrisonville Weather Point, was recording volumetric water content at the 2-inch depth of 6%. Normal for that station in July was 1/8 to 22%. 8% was the threshold below which corn in the silking stage could not set ears reliably. Corn across the county went into silk in the second week of July, in heat that peaked at 103 degrees on the 17th of July. Merrill Tappan's ground, east of the fence line, was being irrigated on a 12-hour cycle when the well pump began to labor. The water table on that ground, drawn down by 3 weeks of continuous overnight pumping during the driest June in 90 years, had dropped 8 feet below its seasonal average by the 20th of July. The irrigation system was rated for drought conditions, not for conditions this prolonged and this severe. Merle switched to night-only pumping to give the aquifer partial recovery time in the daylight hours. But the recovery rate was a foot a day against a 6-foot drawdown, and the corn did not wait. During the first critical week of silking, when the developing kernels need consistent soil moisture to fill, Merle's rows were running on what the irrigation system could not quite deliver and what the subsoil held in reserve, which was less than it had been because the continuous corn rotation and the annual tillage passes had built the same compaction pan at 9 inches that existed on Dottie's untreated ground, and that pan was holding what moisture remained up near the surface, where the 103-degree air could take it. Merle did not say any of this to anyone. He adjusted the pump schedule, and he walked his rows in the evenings, and he counted silks, and he kept his own counsel. He was a farmer. He had known drought before, and he knew what it looked like when a drought was going to cost him and what it looked like when it was going to cost him badly. And by the last week of July, he knew which one this was. That same last week of July, Caleb was in the Krause field with a soil probe at 7 in the morning before the heat came on, and what he found made him stand there with the probe in his hand for a longer time than the reading required. Dottie's field did not look like Dottie's field was supposed to look during a drought. The corn was dark green. Not the pale, rolling green of heat-stressed corn beginning to roll its leaves against the afternoon sun, but a steady deep green that Caleb, standing at the field edge in mid-July with a soil probe in his hand, had to look at for a full minute before he understood what he was seeing. He pushed the probe into the ground at the 12-inch depth. Volumetric moisture content, 22%. It was the same reading as a normal July. He walked to the fence line and pushed the probe into Merle's ground at the edge of the rented field. The reading at 12 inches was 5%. He looked back at Dottie's corn. He looked at Merle's corn. The difference in color was visible from where he stood. Dottie's field was a wall of deep green in July heat, and Merle's was beginning the roll and the pale that told you the plant was redirecting moisture from the leaves to protect the ear. But the ear was going to be underfilled regardless, because the roots had hit the compaction pan and stopped, and the pan was 5% moisture, and the corn knew it even if the yield map would not show it. For another 6 weeks, Barley was standing in the stubble at the field's west margin in the shade of the woodlot edge, regarding Caleb without particular interest. Caleb walked back to the house and found Dottie on the porch shelling field peas and said, "Your soil is holding water." "I know it," Dottie said. The Fragipan sections, he said. Walt figured it out in 2003, she said. It's in the binder. He had been reading the binder for 14 months by then, late evenings after Dottie had gone to bed, with the light on in the kitchen and a cup of coffee going cold beside him. He had started at 1988 and worked his way forward through Walt's small penciled notes on soil color, on scratch depth, on the way a bird-grazed cover crop section behaved differently in the second year than the first and in the fifth year in a way that could not be explained without understanding what the radish roots had done to the channels the turkeys had opened. What Caleb had in 2 years of agricultural business coursework was a framework for understanding farm economics. What Walt had put in the binder was 40,000 hours of watching one piece of ground learn something. Reading it was like reading a letter from a man who had already solved the problem you thought was new. Walt had written in a September 1999 entry a single sentence that Caleb had copied onto a note card and put above the kitchen table. The pan breaks slow and the organic matter builds slow, and when it is done it will hold water long after the well goes dry, and that will be the year the difference is legible. That year had arrived. By the 3rd of August, Cass County was under an agricultural emergency declaration signed by the governor. The county extension office issued an update, noting that 14 counties were affected in the driest summer on record since 1934, with topsoil moisture at the 2-inch depth county-wide having dropped to 4% volumetric content. Corn across the county was tasseling into heat and dry air, and the ear fill rate at the county test, plot south of Harrisonville, had come in at 61%. Dale Poston wrote and distributed the statement. He then drove through the county in his university pickup in the clean boots and with the clipboard, making site visits to confirm crop loss assessments for the emergency declaration. And he noted what he saw, which was uniform damage across the corn acres that had been farmed the conventional way, rolled leaves by noon, plants pulling moisture from the stalks, grain fill already compromised in stands that had been showing 220 bushel potential in June. He turned down Dottie's Lane by accident on the 14th of August, looking for a secondary road that connected to the county route. He found himself looking at a corn stand he could not account for. He stopped the truck. He sat with the engine idling for a moment. Then he shut it off and got out. A corn was over his head. That was not a figure of speech. At his height, standing at the lane's edge, the ears on Dottie's corn were at his eye level or above, and the leaves were extended and dark green and flat, not rolled, not pale. He walked 20 feet into the field between 2 rows and reached up and put his hand on the nearest husk and pressed it. The ear was full. He pulled the husk back on one ear and found 14 rows of kernels filled solid from the base to within 3 rows of the tip. He stood there for a while in the heat. Dottie came out of the barn and found him in the lane when she returned from moving the afternoon water line. She stopped. They looked at each other across the distance of 4 years, and one public meeting and a county-wide drought. Dale said, "Your soil moisture levels." Walt had them figured out, she said. He left a binder. "I said what I said at that 2019 meeting," Dale said. Dottie nodded. She did not add anything to it. She asked him if he wanted to look at the penetrometer readings from the July sampling, and he said yes. And they went into the kitchen and she put Walt's data sheets and Caleb's July readings side by side on the table, and Dale sat down and read through them without speaking for 12 minutes. Which Dottie had learned in 40 years of marriage was exactly how long a careful man needed to understand a set of numbers that had been under his nose for 4 years, and that he was only now seeing clearly. Merle Tappan called the following week. His yield was going to be around 112 bushels per acre, he said. His voice was level. He said it the way a man says a hard thing he has already done his accounting on, gone through the numbers alone before he would say them to anyone, come to terms with the arithmetic in private so that he could say it plainly in company. The irrigation had done what it could. The aquifer recovery had been too slow for the pace of the heat. He asked Dottie what her stand looked like. "I think it's going to be a good year," she said. She did not make him ask her twice. "You should come look at the field after harvest. Bring your soil probe." The 12th of September, 2023, was a clear morning in Cass County. 68 degrees at 8 o'clock with a low wind from the northwest, and the smell of turned earth and rye from the fields that had already been harvested. The Cass County Grain Days field demonstration was held at the Kraus farm that year at Renata Voss's request, after she had driven past the field 3 weeks earlier on a county road and pulled over and sat with the window down for a while. Renata was 44, a buyer for the Heartland Organic Cooperative out of Kansas City, and she had been in the grain business long enough to know what a field was supposed to look like in a drought year and what it was not supposed to look like. And what she had seen through the windshield on that county road did not fit the category she had been placing Cass County in since August. She arrived on the 12th of September in a clean sedan with a soil scientist from the cooperative, Marcus Webb, and a clipboard of her own, and she greeted Dottie briefly and then walked the field from the north end to the south end without saying anything more. Webb walked beside her with his own probe and his own clipboard. They were not in a hurry. They walked slowly, and they stopped often, and Webb pushed his probe into the ground in 3 places and read the gauge and wrote numbers down. It took 40 minutes to walk the field and come back. What Renata did when she came back to the lane was stop at the field's center stand and take out a folding knife and cut an ear from the nearest stalk, and peel the husk back slowly, the way a person does when they are not performing the action for anyone else's benefit, but are actually looking at what they are looking at. The ear was a deep yellow, filled to within 3 rows of the tip. The kernels were plump and round and set close. They were not the shallow, dented, puckered kernels the drought corn produced when the plant had not had enough moisture during grain fill. Webb pulled a probe at 14 inches and wrote down the moisture reading and turned the clipboard so Renata could see it. She looked at it. She wrote something on her own clipboard. Then she straightened up and looked at the field. Not at Dottie, at the field for a long time. "What's the organic matter content in your top 6 inches?" she asked. 4.8%, Dottie said. It was 1.9 when Walt started the rotation. Renata wrote that down. She looked at the field again. The corn was standing the way corn stands when it has been given everything it needed in the right order at the right time, which is to say it was standing straight and full and without apology. "I'm going to want to see the protein numbers from the combine monitor," Renata said, "but I can make you an advance offer on what I'm seeing. Go ahead and run the yield cart." The yield cart, pulled by Dottie's old red Farmall, was already positioned at the north end of the 38-acre block, and Caleb climbed into the tractor cab and ran the north half while Renata and Webb stood at the lane and talked in low voices and wrote things on their clipboard. There was a small crowd by then. Merle Tappan was there, standing with his hands in his jacket pockets and watching the tractor work the rows with an expression that was not quite resignation and not quite wonder, but something in between. 2 neighbors who had come out for the Grain Days demonstration stood behind him. Dale Poston had been there since 8:30, standing at the field edge on the other side of the lane, and he had not said anything to Dottie since he arrived, but he had watched everything. Renata's walk, Webb's probe readings, the ear Renata had cut and examined, the conversation about organic matter content that had lasted less than 45 seconds and left Renata writing for 2 full minutes. The formal came back to the lane. Caleb climbed down from the cab, and he had a printout in his hand, and his face was the face of a person who has just seen a number and has had the 45 seconds of the drive down the lane to process what it meant, and has not yet entirely processed it. He handed it to his grandmother. She looked at it once. She handed it to Renata without comment. Renata read it. She did not speak immediately. She read it again. The lane was quiet. Even the tractor was quiet, the engine ticking as it cooled. 218 bushels per acre, Renata said. She said it in a level voice. The way you say a number you have been in the business long enough to know how to say, without letting your voice do the work the number is going to do on its own. The lane went still. 218. Merle was standing with his hands in his pockets. The county average was 89. His own irrigated ground had yielded 112, and that had felt in the weeks since he had run his combine like something between a modest result and a controlled damage. 218 was not in the same conversation. 218 was not a drought year number. It was barely a good year number for ground with irrigation and full inputs. On a 38-acre field that had last seen synthetic nitrogen in 2017 and had been managed by a 67-year-old woman with 60 turkeys and her dead husband's binder and no hired help and a cover crop seed cost of $14.4 an acre. It was the kind of number that requires a person to stand still for a moment and reconsider the shape of what they thought they knew. The number sat in the air over the lane the way a heavy thing sits. Barley stood at the field margin behind Dottie, unhurried regarding the crowd. Renata did not negotiate. She said, $7.80 a bushel, organic premium plus protein credit. We'll run the full test when it goes to the elevator, but I won't be lower than that. The conventional corn price in Cass County that morning was $4.15 a bushel. Merle looked at the field. He looked at his boots. He did the arithmetic without moving. Dale Poston took off his cap. He turned it in his hands twice. Then he looked across the lane at Dottie and said, "Mrs. Krause, I would very much like to see your husband's binder." Dottie looked at him. "I'll have Caleb get you a copy," she said. "Walt wrote it so it could be copied." Dale nodded. He put his cap back on. He said, "I owe you better than what I said in 2019. You said what the data told you to say," Dottie said. The data was just looking at the wrong layer. Merle stood where he stood for a while after Renata and Webb had gone back to the sedan. He was a quiet man, and he showed his math in his face before he showed it in words. He looked at the field. He looked at the lane. He said to Dottie, "You think a person could start a turkey rotation on a 40-acre block and see results inside of 5 years?" Walt said 7, Dottie said. "If you start with the right cover crop mix and don't get impatient." Merle considered that. "I'm not in a hurry," he said. The winter after the harvest was a planning winter. Dottie's corn sold at $7.8 per bushel on the full 38-acre block, 8,284 bushels at the final weigh, and Caleb ran the numbers on the kitchen table and set his pen down and did not speak for a long time. The farm had been operating debt-free since 2008. That had been enough. This was something else. Dottie paid the property tax, paid the insurance, and put the rest back into the farm in the only way she had ever put money back into it, which was into the ground. She bought a second portable pen setup. She did not expand the flock beyond 60. She had thought about it and decided that 60 was the number Walt had arrived at for a reason she trusted even if she could not fully articulate it, which was that 60 birds on 190 acres at the rotation rate he had designed was the rate at which the land recovered between passes without being asked to do more than it could sustain. She spent 3 Saturday mornings through January hosting what she called walks, not workshops, for 8 farmers from the surrounding county who had called after grain days. Merle came to all 3. Dale Poston came to the 3rd one and sat in the back, and asked 3 careful questions and wrote down the answers. He asked if he could take photographs of the penetrometer data tables Walt had kept. Caleb made him copies of those pages, too. 4 neighbors started turkey rotations the following spring. Dottie sourced them poults from her flock, 60 birds to start, and charged them what she paid for feed, and nothing more. She told them to get a soil probe and use it every season and write down what they found the way Walt had, so that in 15 years someone would have a record of what the birds had done. Caleb took a set of pages from the binder and had them scanned and laminated at the print shop in Harrisonville. He put the laminated set in the barn and gave Dottie back the original, and he kept the electronic files on a drive that he told her he would update as he added his own records. He had been adding to the binder since September. His handwriting was different from Walt's, rounder and less certain, the handwriting of a man still learning the thing he is writing about. That, too, was in order. There is a way of knowing a piece of ground that cannot be taught in a classroom, not because what happens in classrooms is wrong, but because the ground in question is not in the classroom. It is outside, in a specific county, in a specific river bottom profile, with a specific compaction problem, at a specific depth, in a specific watershed that behaves one particular way in a drought year, when every other watershed around it is failing. That knowledge takes time. It takes seasons and soil, probes and pencil notes, and a flock of birds you have been selecting within for 35 years and a dead man's arithmetic running in a 3-ring binder. It cannot be scaled. It cannot be transferred by slide deck or spreadsheet. It can only be walked into, slowly, one section of field at a time, at the pace the land will permit. What the Extension Service measured in Cass County in the summer of 2023 was a drought. What it found hardest to explain when it wrote the Agricultural Emergency Report that fall was one field on the Krause ground that had not received a synthetic input in 6 years and had produced 218 bushels of corn per acre in the worst drought in 90 years, on nothing but turkey dung and rye roots and 35 years of a dead man's attention. Dale Poston put a footnote in that report about the Fragipan data from the penetrometer readings. It was the first time the Krause field had appeared in an extension document. It would not be the last. On a November evening, after the neighbors had gone home from the last walk of the season, and the field had been sown to rye and the portable pens had been wintered over in the barn, Dottie sat on the porch steps with the binder on her knee and Barley at her feet. Barley, who was 7 years old now and would not live forever, whose scratching had broken the Fragipan in the north block during those early spring passes, and who stood in the field on the worst day of the drought in August, like he was standing on any other day, unhurried doing his work. Caleb came out and sat beside her, and she handed him the binder without ceremony. The way you hand a person something that was always going to be theirs. The cornfield was just visible over the rise in the last light, rolled under now and greening with the winter rye, resting. It had earned the rest. What is efficient and what is resilient are not the same thing, and the drought is the argument you cannot answer with a loan or a machine. What survives is what belongs to the ground it grows on, and what belongs to the ground takes longer to build than a single season's certainty allows. Walt Krause had known that, Dottie Kraus had held it for 41 years without asking anyone to believe it. The ground proved it.